Officer Daniel Rodriguez walked through the courthouse doors that Tuesday morning, feeling pretty good about himself. The sun was shining, his uniform was crisp, and he had another routine traffic case to testify about. After 15 years on the force, these courthouse visits were like second nature to him. He knew every corner of this building, every clerk, every bailiff. This was his territory. The morning air conditioning hit him as he stepped inside, and he adjusted his duty belt out of habit. Daniel had always taken pride in his appearance. His badge was polished, his shoes were shined, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew he belonged here. Other officers often joked that he looked like he'd stepped right out of a police recruitment poster. As he made his way toward the courtroom, Daniel noticed the usual mix of people waiting around. There were lawyers in expensive suits checking their phones, family members of defendants looking nervous and out of place, and the regular courthouse staff going about their business. Everything seemed normal until something caught his eye. Sitting quietly in the back row of the gallery was a woman he didn't recognize. She was dressed professionally in a dark blue business suit, her hair pulled back neatly, and she was reading through what looked like official documents. Something about her presence bothered him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Daniel had developed what he called a sixth sense over his years in law enforcement. He could spot trouble from across a room, and right now his instincts were telling him something was off. Maybe it was the way she was studying those papers so intently, or maybe it was just that he didn't recognize her as one of the regular courthouse crowd. The courtroom was filling up with the usual morning cases. Judge Patricia Williams was known for running a tight ship, and Daniel respected that about her. She didn't tolerate any nonsense in her courtroom, which made his job easier when he had to testify. The bailiff, an older man named Frank, who'd been working here longer than anyone could remember, was setting up for the day's proceedings. Daniel took his usual spot near the front where witnesses waited to be called. He glanced back at the woman again. She had opened a leather folder and was reviewing documents that looked official, but from his angle he couldn't make out what they were. Her calm demeanor struck him as odd. Most people in court looked nervous or anxious, but she seemed completely at ease, almost like she was observing rather than participating. His radio crackled softly with routine dispatch calls from around the city. Daniel turned the volume down out of respect for the court, but he kept one ear tuned to what was happening on the streets. Old habits die hard, and even in civilian settings. He never fully switched off his cop mindset. The first case was called, and Daniel watched as a nervous young man approached the defendant's table with his public defender. It was a simple speeding ticket case, the kind Daniel had testified about hundreds of times before. The routine was always the same: state his name, badge number, and years of service, then walk through the details of the traffic stop. But his attention kept drifting back to the woman in the gallery. She was taking notes now, writing in the margins of whatever documents she was reading. Her pen moved with the precision of someone accustomed to reviewing official paperwork. Daniel's curiosity was getting the better of him. During a brief recess, he decided to satisfy his growing suspicion. Something about this situation didn't sit right with him, and his gut had rarely steered him wrong in all his years of police work. He'd seen too many people try to pull fast ones in courtrooms, and he wasn't about to let anything slide on his watch. The woman stood up and began walking toward the front of the courtroom. Her folder clutched professionally in her hand. She moved with purpose, like someone who had official business to conduct. This was exactly what Daniel had been waiting for. In his experience, people who tried to approach the bench or interact with court staff without proper authorization were usually up to something. Daniel rose from his seat and intercepted her path. His training kicked in automatically, and he positioned himself in a way that would prevent her from getting any closer to the judge's bench or the court clerk's area. He'd done this countless times before with people who didn't understand proper courtroom protocol. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, using his most authoritative voice. "Court observers need to remain in the gallery during proceedings. You can't just walk around the courtroom whenever you feel like it." The woman looked up at him with calm, intelligent eyes. There was no fear there, no guilt, no signs of the nervous energy he usually saw when he confronted someone doing something wrong. Instead, she seemed almost puzzled by his intervention. "Officer, I have business with the court," she replied quietly, her voice steady and professional. "I need to speak with the clerk about some official matters." Daniel wasn't buying it. He'd heard every excuse in the book over the years. People always claimed they had official business when they were caught somewhere they shouldn't be. The confidence in her voice actually made him more suspicious, not less. In his experience, the people who were the most trouble were often the ones who acted like they belonged everywhere. "I don't care what you think you're doing here," he said, his voice getting sharper. "This is a courtroom, not a social club. You need to sit back down in the gallery where you belong before I have you removed for disrupting court proceedings." The folder in her hands contained what looked like letterhead and official seals. But Daniel had seen plenty of fake documents in his career. People went to great lengths to create convincing paperwork these days, and he wasn't about to be fooled by some fancy printing and official-looking stamps. Around them, the courtroom had grown quiet. Other people in the gallery were starting to notice the confrontation, and even Judge Williams glanced over from her bench with a questioning look. The bailiff, Frank, had paused in his routine tasks to observe what was happening, but Daniel was focused entirely on the woman in front of him. His years of training and experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, every instinct he had was telling him that this woman was trouble. He wasn't about to back down just because she carried herself with confidence and spoke in a professional tone. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything, though Daniel had no idea just how dramatically his world was about to shift. The woman stood her ground, and that only made Daniel more convinced he was dealing with someone who thought rules didn't apply to her. In his 15 years of experience, he'd learned that the people who argued back were usually the ones with the most to hide. Honest citizens typically apologized and went back to their seats when corrected by a police officer. "Officer, I really think you should look at these documents before this goes any further," she said, holding out the leather folder toward him. Her voice remained calm, but there was something in her tone that suggested she was trying to save him from making a mistake. Daniel didn't even glance at the folder. He'd seen this trick before, where people tried to distract him with paperwork while they figured out their next move. Some of the best con artists he'd encountered over the years were smooth talkers who used official-looking documents as props. "I'm not interested in whatever fake paperwork you're trying to show me," he said, his voice rising loud enough that everyone in the courtroom could hear clearly. "Don't you dare try to intimidate me with some phony documents you probably printed off your computer this morning." Without warning, Daniel knocked the folder from her hands. The leather binder hit the marble floor with a sharp crack and papers scattered everywhere. Official documents with government seals and letterhead spread across the courthouse floor like fallen leaves. Some slid under the benches, others drifted toward the jury box. The sound echoed through the suddenly silent courtroom. Judge Williams looked up sharply from her paperwork, her eyebrows raised in surprise and growing anger. The bailiff, Frank, stopped what he was doing entirely and turned to watch the scene unfold. Even the court reporter's fingers paused over her machine. But Daniel was too caught up in his own righteousness to notice the shocked reactions around him. He was convinced he was doing his job, protecting the integrity of the courtroom from someone who clearly didn't belong there. The scattered papers only reinforced his belief that he was dealing with someone trying to pull a scam. "There's your intimidation tactic," he announced loudly, gesturing at the papers on the floor. "Probably downloaded some official-looking templates and thought you could fool everyone with your little performance." The woman looked down at her scattered documents, then back up at Daniel with an expression he couldn't quite read. It wasn't anger exactly, though she would have been justified in being furious. It was more like disappointment mixed with something that might have been pity. "Officer Rodriguez," she said, reading his name tag, "you're making a very serious mistake right now. I strongly suggest you step back and let me collect these documents so we can resolve this situation quietly." The fact that she knew his name from his badge and was still acting like she had some kind of authority only made Daniel angrier. He'd dealt with plenty of people over the years who thought they could talk their way out of trouble by acting official and using his name like they were old friends. "Are you threatening me?" Daniel demanded, stepping closer to her. His hand instinctively moved toward his radio, ready to call for backup if this woman became physically aggressive. "Because threatening a police officer is a serious crime, lady. Maybe you don't understand how serious the situation is becoming." People in the gallery were starting to pull out their phones. Daniel could see the familiar glow of smartphone screens being activated around the courtroom. In today's world, everyone wanted to record everything, especially when it involved police officers. He'd been filmed plenty of times before and never worried about it, because he always followed proper procedures. At least, he thought he always followed proper procedures. The court clerk, a middle-aged woman named Betty, who'd been working there for over 20 years, was watching the scene with growing concern. She kept looking between Daniel and the scattered papers on the floor, then up at Judge Williams as if she was waiting for someone to intervene. Frank, the bailiff, took a step forward, clearly uncomfortable with how the situation was developing. In all his years working courthouse security, he'd rarely seen a police officer get into a confrontation with someone in the gallery, especially not over something that seemed so trivial. "Officer Rodriguez," Frank called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been keeping peace in courtrooms since before Daniel became a cop. Maybe we should all just take a breath here and figure out what's going on. But Daniel was beyond listening to suggestions. His pride was on the line now, and backing down in front of a courtroom full of people with their phones out would make him look weak. He'd built his reputation on being firm and decisive, and he wasn't about to let some woman with fake paperwork make him look foolish. "I know exactly what's going on here, Frank," Daniel replied, never taking his eyes off the woman. "We've got someone who thinks she can waltz into a courtroom and disrupt proceedings with some kind of scam." "Well, not on my watch." The woman bent down and began collecting her scattered papers. As she gathered them, Daniel could see official seals and letterheads more clearly, but he dismissed them as elaborate fakes. Technology had made it easy for anyone to create convincing-looking documents these days. "You can pick up all the fake paperwork you want," Daniel continued, "but it's not going to change the fact that you don't belong here, and you're disrupting court proceedings. I've seen every trick in the book, and this amateur hour performance isn't fooling anyone." Judge Williams had been watching the entire exchange with growing alarm. She could see some of the scattered documents from her elevated position, and unlike Daniel, she was close enough to make out details that were making her increasingly uncomfortable with how the situation was developing. The woman finished collecting most of her papers and stood up with as much dignity as she could manage under the circumstances. Some of the documents were crumpled now, and one had a footprint on it where someone had accidentally stepped on it during the commotion. "Officer Rodriguez," she said one more time, her voice still remarkably calm despite everything that had happened, "I'm going to give you one last chance to end this before it gets completely out of hand. Look at these credentials, check with your supervisor, or simply ask the judge who I am. But whatever you do, do it quickly, because you're about 30 seconds away from the biggest mistake of your career." Daniel laughed, actually laughed out loud at what he saw as an obvious bluff. "The biggest mistake of my career? Lady, the only mistake I'm making is being too patient with someone who's clearly trying to run some kind of con game in a courthouse. But don't worry, that mistake is about to be corrected." He reached for his radio, ready to call for additional units to remove what he was convinced was a disruptive individual from the courtroom. His finger was already on the button when Judge Williams finally decided she'd seen enough. The next few moments would prove that Daniel's confidence was about to be shattered in the most public and humiliating way possible. Judge Williams had seen enough. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Immediately commanding everyone's attention, the sound cut through Daniel's radio chatter mid-sentence as he was about to request backup. "Officer Rodriguez," Judge Williams called out in a voice that carried the full weight of her authority, "step away from that woman immediately and approach the bench." Daniel felt a flicker of uncertainty for the first time since this whole situation began. Judge Williams had always been professional with him in the past, but there was something different in her tone now. Something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Your Honor," Daniel replied, trying to maintain his confident demeanor. "I'm just handling a disruption in your courtroom. This individual has been—" "Officer Rodriguez," the judge interrupted, her voice rising. "I said approach the bench, now." The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Even the usual background noise of papers rustling and people shifting in their seats stopped completely. Everyone could feel the tension building, like the electric charge in the air before a thunderstorm hits. Daniel walked toward the judge's bench, his boots clicking on the marble floor. Each step felt heavier than the last as doubt began creeping into his mind. Behind him, he could hear the woman gathering the rest of her scattered papers, but he refused to turn around and look. When he reached the bench, Judge Williams leaned forward and spoke in a voice low enough that only he could hear. But her expression was visible to everyone in the courtroom. "Officer Rodriguez, do you have any idea who you just humiliated in my courtroom?" Daniel's mouth went dry. The confidence that had carried him through this entire confrontation suddenly felt like it was built on quicksand. "Your Honor, I was just trying to maintain order and—" "That woman," Judge Williams continued, her voice getting sharper, "is Chief Patricia Jackson, the newly appointed chief of police for this entire city. She was here this morning as part of her first week on the job, observing court proceedings to better understand how the justice system operates in our community." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. He actually took a step backward, his face going pale as the reality of what had just happened crashed over him like a cold wave. Behind him, he could hear murmurs starting to rise from the gallery as people began to understand what they had witnessed. "That's not possible," Daniel whispered, though even as he said it, he knew it was true. The professional demeanor, the calm authority, the official documents he'd dismissed so carelessly, it all suddenly made perfect sense. "I assure you it's very possible," Judge Williams replied, "and extremely unfortunate for you." Daniel turned around slowly as if he was moving through thick mud. The woman, Chief Jackson, was standing near the scattered papers, some of which were still on the floor. She was looking at him with an expression that wasn't angry, wasn't vindictive, but somehow that made it worse. She looked disappointed, like a teacher watching a student fail a test they should have easily passed. The phones that people had pulled out earlier were now recording everything. Daniel could see the little red dots on multiple screens around the courtroom, capturing what was probably the most humiliating moment of his professional life. "In a few hours, this footage would be everywhere. Chief Jackson," Daniel began, his voice cracking slightly. "I had no idea. I didn't realize. I thought you thought I was what, Officer Rodriguez?" Chief Jackson asked quietly. Her voice carried easily through the silent courtroom, and Daniel realized that everyone was hanging on every word of this conversation. Daniel's mind raced, trying to find words that might somehow salvage this disaster, but everything he considered saying only made things worse in his head. How could he explain that he'd assumed she was some kind of troublemaker, without sounding like exactly the kind of officer who made assumptions based on appearances? "I thought you were someone who didn't belong here," he finally managed to say, immediately realizing how terrible that sounded given the circumstances. "And what gave you that impression?" Chief Jackson asked, still in that same calm tone that was somehow more devastating than shouting would have been. The question hung in the air like smoke. Everyone in the courtroom knew the answer, but nobody wanted to say it out loud. Daniel certainly couldn't say it out loud, because doing so would mean admitting to the kind of thinking that ended careers and made headlines. Frank, the bailiff, had moved closer during the exchange, and Daniel could see the older man shaking his head in disappointment. Frank had been around long enough to see plenty of officers make career-ending mistakes, but this one was particularly painful to watch. Betty, the court clerk, was frantically shuffling through papers on her desk, probably looking for the official notification about the new police chief that had been sent to all city departments the week before. Daniel vaguely remembered seeing some kind of memo about it, but he'd been too busy with his regular duties to pay much attention to administrative announcements. "Chief Jackson," Judge Williams called out from the bench, "on behalf of this court, I want to apologize for what you've experienced here today. This is not representative of the professionalism we strive to maintain in our judicial system." Chief Jackson nodded graciously at the judge, then looked back at Daniel. "Officer Rodriguez, I want you to understand something. This incident is going to have consequences, not just for you, but for the entire department. When video of this gets out, and it will get out, it's going to raise questions about training, about department culture, and about the kind of assumptions officers make about citizens." Daniel felt sick to his stomach. He could already imagine the phone calls, the internal affairs investigation, the media attention, the disappointed looks from his fellow officers. 15 years of solid service, and it would all be overshadowed by one terrible mistake. "However," Chief Jackson continued, "it's also going to provide us with an opportunity to have important conversations about respect, assumptions, and proper procedure. Sometimes the most teachable moments come from the most uncomfortable situations." She bent down and picked up the last few scattered papers, straightening them out as best she could. Some of them were torn, others were dirty from the courthouse floor, but she handled them with the same dignity she'd maintained throughout the entire confrontation. "Officer Rodriguez," she said, standing back up to her full height, "report to headquarters immediately following your testimony today. We're going to have a very long conversation about what happened here, and about what happens next. The weight of those words settled over Daniel like a heavy blanket. He knew that conversation would likely determine whether he still had a career in law enforcement by the end of the week. The worst part was that he had no one to blame but himself. As Chief Jackson walked toward the exit, maintaining her professional composure despite everything that had happened, Daniel realized that this moment would follow him for the rest of his life. The courtroom full of witnesses, the phone recordings, the scattered official documents he'd dismissed so arrogantly, all of it would be replayed and analyzed and discussed for years to come. He had wanted to protect the integrity of the courtroom, but instead, he had created the biggest scandal the courthouse had seen in decades, and it was all captured on video, ready to be shared with the world. By the time Daniel finished his testimony and left the courthouse, the world had already changed around him. His phone was buzzing constantly with text messages and missed calls, but he was afraid to look at any of them. The walk to his patrol car felt like the longest walk of his life. 3 hours after the courthouse incident, the first video appeared on social media. Someone in the gallery had uploaded the footage with the caption, "Cop attacks new police chief in court without knowing who she is." Within 30 minutes, it had been shared over 1,000 times. By noon, local news stations were calling the police department for comments. Daniel sat in his car in the courthouse parking lot, staring at his phone screen as the notifications kept pouring in. His partner, Officer Williams, had already called twice, and his sergeant had left a voicemail that Daniel was too nervous to listen to. But the text message that worried him most was from his wife. "Danny, what's going on? My sister just sent me a video that looks like you. Call me." The drive back to the police station felt like driving toward his own execution. Daniel had been through internal investigations before, usually minor complaints about traffic stops or reports that citizens felt were handled improperly. But this was different. This wasn't some routine complaint that would be filed away and forgotten. This was going to be front-page news. When he pulled into the police station parking lot, Daniel noticed several news vans already parked across the street. Reporters were setting up cameras and checking their equipment, preparing for what they probably expected to be a major story. The sight of them made Daniel's stomach turn. Inside the station, the atmosphere was tense. Officers who normally joked around and talked about their shifts were speaking in hushed tones. When Daniel walked through the door, conversation stopped and people looked at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to pity to anger. Sergeant Martinez appeared almost immediately. "Rodriguez, Chief wants to see you in her office. Right now." The walk down the hallway to the chief's office felt endless. Daniel passed bulletin boards covered with department announcements, commendations, and training schedules. Everything that had seemed routine and familiar this morning now felt foreign and threatening. He knocked on the door and heard Chief Jackson's voice call out, "Come in." Chief Jackson was sitting behind the desk that had belonged to the previous chief just a week ago. Her scattered and damaged documents from the courthouse were spread out on the desk, some of them still wrinkled from being stepped on. She looked up when Daniel entered, and he was surprised to see that she didn't look angry. She looked tired. "Sit down, Officer Rodriguez," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Daniel sat down and tried to think of something to say, some way to explain or apologize that might make this situation better, but everything that came to mind sounded hollow and inadequate. "I've been police chief for exactly 6 days, Chief Jackson began, her voice calm but serious. 6 days. And already I'm dealing with a viral video of one of my officers publicly humiliating me in a courtroom full of witnesses. Do you have any idea how that makes me look as I'm trying to establish credibility with this department and this community?" "Chief, I am so sorry," Daniel began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "I'm not finished," she continued. "In the past 3 hours, I've received calls from the mayor, the city council, 3 different news stations, and the head of the police union. The video of our courthouse encounter has been viewed over 50,000 times, and it's being shared on every social media platform you can imagine." Daniel felt like he was shrinking in his chair. Each number she mentioned felt like another nail in the coffin of his career. "But here's what's really troubling me," Chief Jackson continued. "It's not just that you made a mistake. Everyone makes mistakes. It's that you made a series of assumptions about me, based on nothing more than your own preconceptions. You saw a black woman in a courtroom and immediately decided she was trouble. You refused to look at my credentials, dismissed my explanations, and knocked official documents out of my hands because you had already made up your mind about who I was and whether I belonged there. The words stung because they were true. Daniel wanted to deny it, wanted to claim that race had nothing to do with his actions, but he couldn't escape the uncomfortable truth that his assumptions had been based on exactly the kind of biases that good police officers were supposed to overcome. "I've made mistakes before," Daniel said quietly, "but never anything like this. I don't know what I was thinking." "That's exactly the problem," Chief Jackson replied. "You weren't thinking. You were operating on autopilot, making snap judgments based on appearances and assumptions. And that kind of policing is exactly what I was brought here to change." She picked up one of the damaged documents from her desk, a letter of introduction from the mayor's office that was now torn and dirty. "This letter was supposed to be my formal introduction to the courthouse staff," she said. "Instead, it became evidence of how quickly a situation can spiral out of control when officers make assumptions instead of asking questions." Daniel stared at the damaged letter and felt a wave of shame wash over him. That piece of paper represented not just his mistake, but the broader problems with policing that Chief Jackson had been hired to address. "What happens now?" Daniel asked, though he was afraid of the answer. Chief Jackson leaned back in her chair and studied him for a long moment. "That depends on several factors. The internal affairs investigation will take its course and there will definitely be disciplinary action. The extent of that action will depend on your attitude, your willingness to learn from this experience, and your commitment to becoming a better officer." She paused and looked at the scattered documents again. "But here's what I'm most concerned about," she continued. "This incident is going to be used as an example of everything that's wrong with police culture. People are going to point to this video as proof that officers can't be trusted to treat all citizens with respect and dignity, and unfortunately your actions this morning gave them ammunition for that argument." Daniel knew she was right. He'd seen other viral videos of police encounters, and he'd always assumed those officers were just bad cops having bad days. Now he was about to become one of those examples, a cautionary tale played on repeat across the internet. "I want to make this right," Daniel said, and he meant it. "Whatever I need to do, whatever training I need to take, whatever consequences I need to face, I'm ready to do it." Chief Jackson nodded slowly. "That's a start, but making this right isn't going to be easy. And it's not going to be quick. The community's trust in this department was already fragile before today. Your actions this morning made my job significantly harder." Outside the office, Daniel could hear phones ringing and radio chatter and the usual sounds of a busy police station. But inside this room, the weight of what had happened hung heavy between them. The conversation that would determine his future was just getting started. 6 months later, Daniel Rodriguez sat in a training classroom at the police academy, watching a new group of recruits learn about bias and assumptions in law enforcement. On the screen at the front of the room was a freeze frame from the courthouse video, showing the moment he knocked the documents from Chief Jackson's hands. The instructor, a veteran officer named Captain Thompson, clicked to the next slide. This incident became a case study, not because Officer Rodriguez was a bad cop, but because he made assumptions that many of us might have made under similar circumstances. The question is, what can we learn from his mistake? Daniel watched from the back of the room as the recruits discussed the video. Some of them had probably seen it on social media months ago when it first went viral. Others were seeing it for the first time as part of their training. All of them were learning from his worst moment. The months following the courthouse incident had been the most difficult of Daniel's career. The internal affairs investigation lasted 6 weeks and resulted in a formal reprimand, mandatory bias training, anger management counseling, and reassignment to administrative duties. His patrol days were over, at least for now. The media attention had been intense but mercifully brief. Local news stations ran the story for about a week, with follow-up pieces about police reform and community relations. National outlets picked it up for a day or two, using it as another example of the need for better police training. Then, as these stories usually do, it faded from public attention as newer controversies took its place. But within the police department and the local community, the effects lasted much longer. Chief Jackson used the incident as the foundation for a comprehensive review of department policies and training procedures. Every officer was required to complete additional bias training, and new protocols were established for interactions with citizens in all settings, including courtrooms. Daniel's relationship with his fellow officers was complicated. Some supported him, understanding that anyone could have made a similar mistake in the heat of the moment. Others were angry that his actions had brought negative attention to the entire department and made their jobs more difficult. The divide was still there even months later. His family life had been affected too. His wife had been supportive, but their teenage daughter was embarrassed by the viral video and the attention it brought to their family. For weeks, she'd asked to be dropped, off a block away from school to avoid questions from classmates who had seen her father's humiliation online. The most surprising part of the whole experience was his ongoing relationship with Chief Jackson herself. Rather than treating him as a problem to be managed, she had involved him in the department's reform efforts. Daniel found himself reviewing policy changes, participating in community outreach programs, and sharing his experience with other officers as an example of how quickly things could go wrong. The hardest part, Daniel told the recruits when Captain Thompson called him forward to speak, wasn't the internal investigation or the media attention or even the embarrassment. The hardest part was looking in the mirror and admitting that I had become the kind of officer I used to criticize. He looked out at the young faces staring back at him, all of them probably wondering if they would ever find themselves in a similar situation. I had 15 years of solid service before that morning in the courthouse, Daniel continued. I thought I was a good cop. I thought I treated everyone fairly. But when I was put to the test, when I had to make a split-second decision about someone I didn't recognize, I failed. I made assumptions based on appearance and preconceptions, and those assumptions nearly ended my career. One of the recruits raised her hand. Officer Rodriguez, how do you make sure something like that doesn't happen again? Daniel had been asked that question dozens of times over the past 6 months, in training sessions and interviews and counseling sessions. The answer had evolved as he'd learned more about himself and his own biases. You start by admitting that you have biases, he said. Everyone does. The danger comes when you pretend you don't, because then you stop watching for them. Now, before I make any assumptions about a situation or a person, I force myself to stop and ask questions. Real questions, not interrogation, just basic human interaction. Another recruit spoke up. Do you think you'll ever go back to patrol? That was the question Daniel asked himself every day. Chief Jackson had made it clear that returning to patrol was possible, but only after he had demonstrated sustained improvement and completed additional training. More importantly, Daniel wasn't sure he wanted to go back until he was absolutely certain he wouldn't repeat his mistake. Maybe, Daniel replied honestly, but only when I'm sure I can be the kind of officer this community deserves. Right now I'm learning more about policing from a desk job than I learned in years of patrol work. After the training session ended, Daniel walked back to his office in the administrative wing of the police station. His current assignment involved reviewing citizen complaints and helping to develop new training materials. It wasn't as exciting as patrol work, but it had given him a different perspective on law enforcement and its impact on the community. Chief Jackson appeared in his doorway around lunchtime, something she did occasionally to check on his progress and discuss ongoing projects. How did the training session go? She asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. Good, I think, Daniel replied. The recruits asked good questions. They seemed to understand that what happened to me could happen to anyone who isn't careful. Chief Jackson nodded. That's exactly the point. Your experience has become one of our most effective teaching tools, not because you were a bad officer, but because you were an experienced officer who made a preventable mistake. She paused and looked at the photos on Daniel's desk. Pictures of his family and commendations from his years of service. I've been thinking about something, she said. The courthouse incident was obviously a low point for both of us, but in some ways it might have been the best thing that could have happened to this department. Daniel looked at her with surprise. How do you figure that? Before that morning, I was just another new chief trying to implement reforms that officers would probably resist or ignore, Chief Jackson explained. But your mistake gave us a concrete example of why those reforms were necessary. It made the training real instead of theoretical. She was right, Daniel realized. The changes Chief Jackson had implemented might have taken years to gain acceptance if they had been introduced as abstract concepts. But with the courthouse video as a reference point, officers understood exactly what behaviors needed to be changed. Plus, Chief Jackson added with a slight smile, It showed the community that I'm willing to hold officers accountable while still working with them to improve. That's built more trust than any press conference or public statement could have accomplished. Daniel looked at the stack of citizen complaint files on his desk, each one representing someone who had felt mistreated by police officers. 6 months ago, he might have dismissed many of these complaints as people trying to avoid consequences for their actions. Now, after experiencing his own moment of poor judgment, he approached each complaint with more empathy and understanding. The courthouse incident would always be part of his story and part of the department's story, but instead of being just a cautionary tale about what not to do, it had become the foundation for positive change. Daniel's worst moment had become a catalyst for making both him and his department better. As he watched Chief Jackson walk back to her office, Daniel reflected on how much had changed since that Tuesday morning in court. He was a different officer now, more thoughtful and self-aware. The department was different too, more focused on community relations and bias awareness. And while the path forward wasn't always clear, it was a path built on honest recognition of past mistakes and genuine commitment to improvement. The viral video that had nearly destroyed his career had ultimately saved it, and maybe helped save his department too.